If you're watching this video, you've probably heard of the character Hannibal Lecter. Since his introduction in 1981, he's gained a sense of infamy over the years, resulting in multiple movie and TV adaptations. Whether you first became aware of him through one of those, or from the books he originated from, it's clear that something about him has captivated audiences for over 40 years. So, I went all the way back to the beginning to find out why. In this review, I'll be covering all 4 of the original Hannibal Lecter books written by Thomas Harris himself. While not all of the books take place in chronological order, I'll be reviewing them in the order they were published, because that is the most logical sense to me. And as precaution, there will be spoilers for every book I've mentioned, and I will also be talking about sensitive subjects in this video, including but not limited to cannibalism and murder. Please watch at your own discretion. To start talking about Hannibal Lecter, we have to go back to his very first appearance. Red Dragon was first published in 1981 and focuses on former FBI profiler Will Graham as he hunts down a serial killer known only as the Tooth Fairy. While this novel is most notable for introducing Hannibal Lecter, who actually only appears during a small portion of the book, it is also a remarkable read all on its own. The name was inspired by artist William Blake's watercolor paintings, The Great Red Dragon and The Woman Clothed in Sun, which depict various scenes from the Book of Revelation. These paintings are also an important part of the book's plot, starting a serious trend of the importance of outside inspiration and research to the books. Harris does a startling amount of research, from the more expected classes and interviews with the FBI to various pieces of art, literature, and history and science that he draws on for inspiration. It's common for the acknowledgments of a Hannibal Lecter book to reference other media and the various people he consulted while working on the project. This was easily one of my favorite parts of the books because I got to learn about a new and interesting topic along with Harris. From Italian literature to post-occupation France to African moths, you never know what you're going to get. One of the things I found most interesting in Red Dragon was the incredible detail on the different aspects of FBI investigations in the 1980s, which really was fascinating to read today. But outside of the vast amounts of research he does, where Harris really shines is in creating remarkable characters. Well, the easiest and most prominent example of this is obviously Hannibal Lecter, whose infamy speaks for himself. The far more interesting characters in Red Dragon are that of Will Graham and Francis Dolarhyde. Throughout the book, Harris switches perspectives between different characters, allowing us to spend time inside the minds of serial killers and FBI profilers alike. It was fascinating to read how Graham thinks about crime scenes or how Dolarhyde's backstory turned him into a killer. Harris has a knack for creating complex and interesting characters, and this extends to the relationships between these characters, such as when Dolarhyde falls for his co-worker, Reba McClane. The exploration of their relationship and how it changed the characters is handled incredibly well throughout the book. This great characterization continues into the second and arguably most famous book in the Hannibal Lecter series, Silence of the Lambs. Published in 1988, the book follows FBI trainee Clarice Starling as she seeks the help of Hannibal Lecter on catching Buffalo Bill, the FBI's nickname for a serial killer known for skinning his victims. Starling uses Lecter's advice and her own intuition to catch Buffalo Bill on her own, whose real name ends up being James Gum, before he can kill his latest victim, the daughter of the Tennessee senator. The novel ends with Starling gaining a claim at the FBI and Lecter escaping from custody, telling Starling in a letter that he has no plans to call on her because, and I quote, "the world is more interesting with her in it." This book is really just Harris at his best. The pacing is perfectly balanced and the story keeps you hooked from the beginning to the end. I struggled to find a good focus for this section because there isn't much to say about this book besides the fact that it's just that good. I could talk about the masterful use of suspense or the Oscar-winning film adaptation, but most everything about this book has already been said. If there's anything you should take from this needlessly lengthy review, it's to read The Silence of the Lambs. It's just something that you have to experience for yourself. But despite all the amazing things one could say about this book, my favorite will always be the character of Clarice Starling. Where do I begin with Clarice? This book, and Hannibal, the other book, not the NBC series, which I'm sure you're probably more aware of, despite what their names and summaries and pop culture references might suggest, aren't really about Hannibal Lecter. He's just an important character in Clarice's story and her development. The relationship forces her to look within and discover new parts of herself which help her rise to the occasion. Clarice is the heart and center of the story. Without her, the book just wouldn't be complete. My all-time favorite scene in the book is after the senator takes Clarice off the case. She refuses to give up and goes to where Lecter has been relocated to try to get one more piece of information out of him. The scene perfectly encapsulates Clarice's drive and her strong moral compass. Her empathy is evident as she pushes forward not for the senator, or for the FBI, or for Lecter, but for the victim she saw at the autopsy and all the victims that came before her. For me, this scene cemented character as Clarice I just couldn't stop reading about. Her story, along with Lecter's, continues in the third book of the series, eloquently titled Just Hannibal. While The Silence of the Lambs remains an objectively better book, in my opinion, and probably the best in the series, this one is far more interesting to look at and analyze. Released in 1999, the novel takes place after The Silence of the Lambs and follows the same characters, namely Hannibal and Clarice. The best way to describe the plot is that of three narratives stacked on top of each other in a trench coat. The first plotline introduced in the book follows Clarice and her struggles in the FBI as a drug raid gone wrong brings her under intense scrutiny both from the public and from her superiors. We also learn that her once promising career has been sabotaged by her corrupt co-worker, Paul Krenler, after she refused to sleep with him. Figures. We start the second plotline when Hannibal sends her a letter expressing his condolences and offering her advice, learning along the way that he has fled to Italy and is living under an assumed name. Alienated from the rest of the FBI, Jack Crawford, a character previously mentioned in both Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs, puts Clarice in charge of apprehending Hannibal. Meanwhile, in the third and final plotline, we meet our main villain for this book, Mason Verger, a bedridden, wealthy, sadistic pedophile. With the help of Sardinian assassins, he plots revenge on Hannibal for disfiguring him years earlier while acting as his therapist. The plan? To feed Hannibal to a new breed of pigs he created that will eat him alive. I'm not joking. Because of his immense wealth and power, Mason is able to offer a bounty on Hannibal, which is picked up by Italian Inspector Ronaldo Pazzi? I've never had to say that out loud. I might be wrong. When the kidnapping proves unsuccessful, with Hannibal disemboweling the inspector, he flees to the United States and attempts to deliver a birthday gift to Clarice. While he is captured by Mason, Clarice pursues him but is shot by a tranquilizer dart, and Hannibal carries her to safety. Mason is killed by his sister Margot, and after acquiring his sperm so she can claim their whole inheritance, she pins the murder on Hannibal. The book doesn't end there, but considering just how controversial the ending is, I'll save it for the end of my analysis. Opinions on this book are far more mixed than those which came before it. To get it out of the way, my main issue with this book is the pacing. While my summary of the events that took place in Italy took barely 2 sentences, in the book it takes over 200 pages. There's far too much focus on the two characters carrying this plotline, Hannibal Lecter and Ronaldo Pazzi. Firstly, Hannibal just doesn't work well as a main character. The horror and intrigue that surrounded him and cemented his place in pop culture comes from his sparse appearances in the first book, all while primarily in captivity. Allowing him to roam the world freely, and with more focus on him, just removes the interest. Although this is in some part necessary for the ending to work at all, this could be achieved to much better success by continuing the focus on Clarice, in my opinion. For large parts of the story, we drift away from her narrative, therefore losing it, and therefore losing the heart of the story. By continuing to use Hannibal where he should be as a supporting character in her story, it allows them both to develop without losing too much of what makes Hannibal, well, Hannibal. Secondly, the Italy part just drags on for far too long. Pazzi, while sometimes interesting, is not nearly enough to carry this plotline to completion. He really only works as a foil to Clarice, which does not warrant 200 pages of this storyline. Throughout the book, both him and Clarice experience a disillusionment with their respective federal establishments, but react in very different ways. While Clarice sticks to her own sense of personal honor and moral code, continuing her character traits established in The Silence of the Lambs, Pazzi turns to greed and avarice, continuing the connection to his ancestor mentioned in the book. This also starts the themes of greed and taste that continue over the course of the book. When Clarice sets out to catch Hannibal, she uses his taste in food, music, cars, and other luxuries to track him down. But Mason, while also significantly wealthy, has far more greed than taste. Not only is his role as a villain crucial for cementing these themes, he also serves as a way to further tie Hannibal and Clarice together. From his very introduction, he is described as something less than human, his demeanor consistently compared to deep-sea creatures and the eel he keeps in his room. He's a monster who preys on children and continuously abuses his sister. Not only does this lessen Hannibal's past crimes slightly, it also creates a comparison between his motives to Mason's, who is motivated by both revenge and a sick pervertedness. His mission to capture and torture Hannibal turns a serial killer into someone that the audience roots for against their better judgment. It also puts him and Clarice on the same team, both of them united against Mason physically and morally. All of this builds up to the eventual ending, where after psychoactive drugs and communal brain eating, Hannibal and Clarice become lovers and disappear together. I'm not making this up, this is on the Wikipedia page. You can understand why it was so controversial. I actually loved the ending. In my mind, the pieces for their relationship were planted way back in their first meeting. In The Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal manipulates a man to kill himself after he insults Clarice, where he dies by quite literally eating his words, by which I mean his tongue. He also notices and is concerned when Clarice is injured, not to mention his line, "People will say we're lovers." Hannibal also does a good job building to their eventual relationship. Clarice loses the stability of the FBI in her life after being put on probation. Her only confidant there, Jack Crawford, grows closer and closer to retirement with each passing day. Her closest friend, Ardelia Mapp, has other friends and connections she can rely on, a life she can turn to if Clarice leaves. Losing her reliance and affection for institutions allows Clarice to grow, letting go of her childhood traumas, which allows her to embrace Hannibal as a lover. The previously mentioned brain eating was also of one Paul Krenler, the aforementioned awful FBI employee who tormented Clarice, which makes the scene overall more cathartic than terrifying. My only real issue with the ending is that it's far too short. I could have used less time spent in Italy and far more time to focus on Clarice and Hannibal's feelings changing and evolving after their escape from Mason Verger. While this book might just be my favorite in the Lecter series, I still think it could have used more Clarice Starling, which is unfortunate since the fourth and final book contains no Clarice at all. And so, we end where we begin, as the last book chronicles the rise of the titular character Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Rising, released in 2006, is a prequel that explores the childhood and teen years of Hannibal, spanning from Lithuania during World War II to post-occupation France. As a child, Hannibal's family was killed by a German dive bomber save for him and his sister Mishka. When their family's lodge was occupied by deserters, their lack of supplies led them to cannibalize Mishka. Hannibal has now lost all of his family, save for his uncle, who takes Hannibal to stay with him and his wife, Lady Murasaki. In France, Hannibal becomes a successful medical student and also carries out his first kill, a butcher who insulted his aunt. After remembering details about his sister's killers, he returns to Lithuania and begins a quest of revenge. In the process, he barely escapes the scrutiny of the French police, successfully avenges his sister, and loses the favor of Lady Murasaki forever. At the end of the book, he moves to the United States, beginning to resemble the character's first appearance all the way back in Red Dragon. The origin of this book is complicated, to say the least. De Laurentiis, again not sure I said that right, a producer on multiple Hannibal film adaptations, admits in an EW interview to Tilling Harris, "If you don't do the prequel, I will do it with someone else. I don't want to lose this franchise, and the audience wants it." If this assertion is true, it certainly puts Harris in a tricky spot. Write a prequel you've never wanted to write in the first place, or lose one of the most important characters you've ever created. You and I already know what Harris chose. And while the book itself isn't spectacular, I much prefer the story coming from the mind of the original author, rather than someone like De Laurentiis turning it into another overdone horror franchise. With Harris, it still feels like a Hannibal Lecter novel. While the beginning was very boring, which is partially fueled by my lack of interest in the German occupation of Lithuania, it got better the further along I got. You just have to stick with it. While the story is not nearly as remarkable as its predecessors, there is still some interest in Hannibal's revenge schemes or his incredibly complicated relationship with his aunt. One of my favorite parts was the continued use of birds as a metaphor, contrasting the frozen birds Hannibal sees his captors eating at the beginning of the novel to him releasing exotic birds many years later, showing a complete arc of his character that turns him into what we know as Hannibal Lecter. It also ties back to a comment he made about Clarice in Hannibal, in which he compares her to a type of bird that completes intense dives, further cementing their two characters together. Overall, the book does a good job at orienting itself amidst the rest of the series, not standing too at odds with what we already know and love. I certainly loved reading these books. I wish I had some sort of snappy takeaway from this, something to show for the 2,000 words I wrote about books that largely came out before I was born. I could say I learned how to write better characters, better suspense, better books. I learned how to create a mind palace and hypothetically train pigs to eat men alive. I read hundreds of pages about beheadings, disembowelings, and skinnings. I found a connection to these characters amidst all this violence and murder. But the impact these books have had on me and on thousands of others is more than just words. There's something ephemeral about them that has captured me in their web, something that has turned a side character into an international phenomenon. If you, like me, want to know what makes Hannibal Lecter so infamous, you just have to experience it for yourself. Read the books. I promise you won't regret it. And that's all, folks. thank you all for watching. I'm glad you sat with me. If you want to read this instead of watching it, I have a copy of it on my blog, which I'll link down below. And as always, if you enjoyed, please subscribe, like this video, comment, share it with your friends. Any little bit of support helps, and I'll probably be talking about more books and writing and movies and whatever I'm interested in the moment at my channel. So if you enjoyed it, please stay around. It would be nice. And have a great day. Bye!